I'm Stephen Robinson, and welcome to the Playtyper Guy podcast. My guest today is Madupe Ayinde, author of A Song of Legends Lost, a three-part sci-fi epic coming your way in 2025. So, let's get into this while my wife is still listening. Madupe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I have to say, I am really excited to talk about your book. I'm gonna put a screenshot up again of it, of your, what I saw on your blog, A Song of Legends Lost, and this epic fantasy trilogy. Uh, I'd love to hear a bit about the book itself, or the story itself, what inspired you to write it, and then also kind of the journey of getting it published, because that was almost uh, a story into itself. So
Yeah, it's a journey of 20 years. So A Song of Legends Lost is an epic fantasy trilogy. It's the first in an epic fantasy trilogy. It's about a world where warriors can summon their ancestors to fight in battle. That's the sort of short version. The longer version is it's a multi point of view um, fantasy set in a world inspired by a number of pre-colonial cultures. It's a very complicated book with a magic system that's based on lost technology, and it's broadly speaking about colonialism, the insidious side of colonialism. Epic fantasy is a genre that always explores empires, but often not in a very critical way, in my opinion. And it's out next year. It comes out in April 2025 in the UK with Orbit. And then in America, it's out in May 2025. I don't think the announcement's been made yet about my US publisher, but it's going to be May in the US. My journey. I've always been a fan of science fiction, fantasy, and horror from I don't remember a time when I wasn't. Epic fantasy was always my first love in terms of literature. It's the genre that I read a lot as a teenager. Um, I'd also always had writing in my bones. I started writing stories when I was 4 years old. It never occurred to me not to write stories, but as I got older and started to think about it as a career, it just seemed like something that was completely closed off to me. Part of that is because I come from a working class background, and my focus was you get a job that is reliable and steady, and you have money to make sure that you've got home and food. So even when I was quite young, I never thought of it as a career path that I would be able to pursue on its own. And I kind of feel sad for my younger self that I didn't do that, because I think that I sort of missed out on a lot of years where I could have really given it a shot early on. But I didn't. And the other thing about my journey is that I really struggled with confidence for a long time. And I think part of that is maybe my personality, but part of it is also when you are a woman of color, especially a Black woman of color, writing. Growing up in the 80s and 90s as I was, and writing in a genre that you rarely ever see yourself either as a writer or on the page, it's an uphill struggle. So for a long time, I sort of felt like I'm writing these words, but who is going to read them? Who is going to publish them? And that is the sort of thing that it takes a lot of time and work to kind of undo in your own mind. Um, I think I sent my first query letter when I was about, it must have been around 2004, something like that. And I sent it to one agent, and she sent me a very nice rejection. And I was like, oh, well, if this agent thinks it's rubbish, must be rubbish. I'll put it in a bin and start a new book. And that pattern repeated itself for me for a long time. And it sort of took really the pandemic, to be honest, to make me think I need to actually get over my lack of confidence, query the way you're supposed to, and have a good shot of this. So it was in 2020 when I sort of took the decision, look, I'm going to finish the book that I was working on, which is the book that became A Song of Legends Lost, and I'm going to actually throw myself behind it. So I think it was early 2021 when I started querying that book. At the same time, I was writing short stories, which is again something I had read a lot of, but felt that I couldn't necessarily do. And again, I regret not having more faith in myself because I love writing short stories. I love the short story community, and I've had several short stories published. So I feel like I should have done that earlier as
Mhm.
well. Um, so I queried during 2021, and I also entered a competition called the Future Worlds Prize, which is a UK competition for science fiction and fantasy writers of colour. And I was shortlisted for that. And I let the agents who were reading my book know about the shortlisting, and I think that did push me up the pile a little bit faster. And in the same week that the prize winner was to be announced, I got an offer of representation, and then it was like a few days later when I found out I'd won the prize, and the rest is sort of history.
Mhm.
So it was a long journey, but I've grown a lot as a writer in that time. So even though I wish I had tried earlier on, I'm happy with where I am now.
Oh, that's great. And I'd read this on your blog as well of when you talked about the first rejection being feeling like this story is no good or this novel is no good, especially if and some people have written an entire book before querying it. And then it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to stuff this in a drawer. Whereas sometimes it's about the query itself. Maybe I write a different query. Why do I, and, you know, I always found it's interesting, the sort of the history of people who have passed on great stories and great films. It's sometimes, I think, heartening to kind of go back and look at every big, dramatic, epic movie or show that we think is like everyone was like breaking down the doors for it, and actually wasn't the case. Like,
Yeah,
I think even Star Wars was initially like, "What are you doing?" And then, Lucas was accepted someplace else. And so it really
yeah,
is, you said, like having the confidence in yourself, but even that has its own sort of racial and gender bias as to
yeah,
who has. So when you hear, like, say for instance, Quentin Tarantino being like, even I'm working in a video store, but I know this is brilliant and I'm not gonna like let anyone, change my script or not let me direct it. That sort of comes from a confidence of, his own sort of white maleness in a way, would you say?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing about the querying is like in those days in the early 2000s, the internet was sort of quite young, and I didn't have access to any of the information about how you query, what publishing even looks like. The only sort of route, the only knowledge I had was that I had done work experience because I had a very nice tutor at university who set me up with work experience at her publisher. And so when you come from a certain background, before the internet and in the early days of the internet, you do not have the information. You have no means of accessing that information. And that is another thing that really holds people back, I think.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think the internet is quite democratizing in that way of like getting access to how to sort of in many ways get into a club, how to speak a certain
Mhm.
language, especially
Yep.
in that regard, and how to pitch yourself, and also in ways to get bits of your work out. So it's like a blog. Maybe you post a short story there, and people can then see it. And it's like, oh, this person can at least write. There are many ways to do it, but other than that, it's very tough. You think this mountain of like people are slogging through, thousands of submissions or
Yeah.
letters, and it can almost feel like a lottery. It can feel overwhelming. I know that myself. It's tough because it's just, when you're a writer, you want to actually be read. If you're, a playwright, you want your work to be performed. You want that result. So when the idea is just on kind of a page and not to be out there, it feels like you're sort of, creating something that could never thrive. It's a very difficult thing to do, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
not all of us are sort of um like Emily Dickinson of just like, I'm gonna write brilliant stuff. I don't want anyone to see it until after I'm dead. Most of us don't want that, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I was very bad at showing people my work as well. I would not show friends and family. There's so much I've written that no one has read. But you know, my aim was always to be read. Um, as you were saying earlier, there are so many examples of media that were rejected multiple times and then went on to be massive. And I think something I wish I'd known or thought about when I was younger is it does take only one. You only need one yes. And it is about finding the right person to work with you. Although, as a woman of colour, a black woman of colour, especially, I say that with a grain of salt because, you know, it's not a level playing field and our voices are often not understood properly. But the overall message of it takes only one is something that I wish that I had understood earlier. It takes only one yes. It doesn't matter how many rejections. The one yes is what you need to be focused on.
Absolutely. And yes, exactly. Like when the gatekeepers don't look like us or have our experience, I mean, it's all subjective, right? So it's like, this is a great story. This speaks to me. And I don't begrudge anyone for having their personal experience inform what speaks to them. So they're like, oh, this is great. And I'm sure there's tons of people out there like me who would buy this story because it's
Yeah,
me. And that is sort of the ability to connect there. If you don't have that, then you're sort of finding someone who's either able to still see some, even if it's outside their own experience, but also to think that there's going to be an audience for it, and that
yeah,
is sort of a quite an uphill battle. But I think what is fascinating is, as you would think, so like in science fiction or fantasy, these sweeping stories, just okay, was people of color. If I'm pitching Star Wars, how and if Luke and or Leia are black, how could you suddenly say this isn't a story that could sell? And I feel like that
yeah,
is something that people in this genre are kind of encountering. And it can be tough because as I said, I think my mother personally was someone who was huge into sci-fi, horror, that sort of thing. That's how I got into it originally.
yeah,
And I knew lots of people of color who were into this. And as you grow up, I'm sort of solidly middle aged, and I just remember, like, you just sort of people of color don't exist. There's sort of the classic Richard Pryor routine about going to see Logan's Run, and it's like no black people, and it's set in the future, and he's
yeah,
like white folks aren't planning for us to be here. Like, what's going on? And so
yeah,
often there's like a future with literally no, like, we don't kind of exist in this fantasy or this world.
yeah,
And it becomes a sense of, well, we enjoy this work, we're part of contributing to it by seeing the movies or shows or buying it. And why can't we be part of the imagination? Why can't an elf be black, especially in things that don't
yeah,
exist, or a mermaid be black? Like, like, no, all of fantasy is this sort of screen. And what you were talking about, especially with colonialism, a lot of these issues that had been, is often addressed in sci-fi or fantasy. If you peek to it, like, the different races of aliens might not get along. Like, there's the metaphor is there,
yeah,
but there's a lot of tension if the metaphor becomes more explicit. So it is still, there's race here, or there's um especially with colonialism, because the idea is like, okay, well, we'll just set it in a world where the queen looks like you, and everyone's diverse, without acknowledging how certain aspects of, say, a monarchy or sort of imperialism and
yeah,
colonialism are so connected to race. Like, you can't separate those things. Um, and something I'd seen a comment from you on social media about the recent Doctor Who episode, Dot and Bubble, which I thought was a very good exploration of race, confronting it in a very modern era, like, sort of and confronting our own sort of biases. Often it's sort of, I mean, the Doctor Who showrunner Russell T Davies talked about not people would always think of it as something in the past as opposed to existing in a sort of futuristic world and our futuristic, in our own modern um, biases. And I'd love to know your thoughts on that episode, and especially when connected to your own work, because it seemed um, colonialism to me was very much the colonialist rhetoric, the colonialism that I felt like a lot of viewers, especially white viewers, weren't necessarily picking up on as sort of the key to racism, particularly white supremacy versus xenophobia, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. They used, I think, when they were setting off at the end of the episode, they used the phrase pioneers like our ancestors.
Hmm.
And I think early on, the first shot that you get of the dome where they live, um, the forest that you see, it's sort of got a mist on it. To me, it looks like a rainforest. And I just
Hmm.
think there was a lot of, who was on that planet? There were probably people there, and or there might be people there, and someone's providing their food. And, I just felt there were certainly a lot of colonial undertones um, to that episode. But I think it was interesting to me straight away as soon as I saw the screen with all the white faces on. I was like, "Wait a minute, are they all white?" And I was like, "It looks to me like they are all white. This is a decision." So for those people that sort of were saying, "Oh, it's a real surprise at the end," all the way through, I was like, "Well, there's clearly something going on here," because especially with a show like Doctor Who that is so careful in the casting choices and is so thoughtful about the context in which it's airing episodes, there's no way that they would accidentally, if
Hmm.
ever they, I mean, let's be real, there's never a time in history where you would accidentally recruit an entire cast that is white. Even if that time is because of the structural racism that was maybe more um, impactful than it is now, although it's still hugely impactful. But they straight away, that was to me, "Oh, okay, that's what this show's gonna be about," as soon as you see that
Hmm.
and notice that. And there w it it's quite hard for me to put myself in the shoes of someone who didn't see all those things, all the way through. But what I think was really important is, you were saying about it being in the past. I had a discussion with a friend about this episode, and I think they were talking about, oh, they were all so like, why were they all so young? It must have been about Gen Z. That's why they were all so young. And I was thinking, well, I think it's quite important that they were all so young because it just for me rammed home the point that it's not a bunch of old people with backwards views. It's actually young people today. Um, and one of the most insidious ways in which racism continues is through these tiny microaggressions. So I thought it was quite important to the episode that they were young for that reason.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's the two things. Either it's all in the past, so they go back to a time where it's in the past. I think a previous under the previous showrunner, they had an episode that said called Rosa in 1955. So it's
Yes.
clear it's segregation, and these are bad people being racist. Someone's using a term, so it's going to call it's things that are very, in a way, obviously, can be removed from what people of color more likely experience right now, and things that are less open for debate. And here, what I find is sort of the ability to have the debate and the sort of, again, to have the darker point of, yes, young people who I find also there's sometimes a classist bent to how racism is depicted.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not the ignorant uh, people, with a background. I'm from the South, so with a Southern accent, it's well-off people. And so much, of course, what I really appreciate what with Russell T Davies did there was I felt create a sort of art form where, again, how Black people and uh, you know white people are responding to it can be different, and it causes like
Mm.
to rewatch and to challenge yourself and your own biases. So again, the idea of like it's a choice. So the idea of everyone's all white, and and people say, well, maybe it's like space Seattle seems to be very white, Portland's very white. Well, that doesn't mean you're racist. It's like, okay, where there's a choice and a history to how areas, especially in America, become
Yeah.
predominantly white. Like Oregon used to have no black people in the dome. It literally
Yeah.
had like no black people were allowed in these areas. So when you are in all white spaces, that is the result of a choice. That could be a passive choice. Like that doesn't necessarily mean that those folks are virulent white supremacists, just maybe passive beneficiaries of white supremacist system.
Mm.
But and then the argument that, oh, I just assumed they were very wealthy because he talks about being wealthy. But then again, you're feeding into, well, if a culture where only white people are the richest and the wealthiest, that is also a choice. That is usually a product of a white supremacist system who, again, is
Yeah.
providing, especially when they're being presented as useless, who's providing their food, who's helping them. It's very much a clear, implication. And the people who seem to think that they they're xenophobic, and I define xenophobia as being like, we've never seen a black person before. But this wasn't like, oh, you have different skin color, I want to touch your hair
Yeah.
type. It's very clearly, she's not shocked to see a black face. She is offended. This is clearly, um black people do exist. So it's sort of like,
Yeah.
did the slugs actually come in and wipe out, the Confederacy? It's like, they're actually helping, because where are black people in this society? They do exist because these people, their racism is clearly seen as it exists, a reaction to the existence of black people. It's not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, the way that she spoke to him throughout the episode was made it so clear. I mean, it was the actress, I thought, did it really well. Her face would screw up when she was speaking to him. All of
Mhm.
her sentences were as dismissive as they could be. It was the sort of expression of disgust that she had a lot of times. But there were so many clues. Like when I was watching it back, the colours, they're blue and yellow. It's like all the way through. It's the Aryan colours. All their clothes, the backgrounds, everything. And I think it's interesting reading what some people were saying, sort of excusing why they didn't pick up on the cues. They were saying, "Oh, well, you know, I thought it could have been just this, or I thought it could have been just that." And
Mhm.
those are exactly the things that go through your mind when you're trying to decide if something, is a racial microaggression.
Oh
And
yeah.
and I think it's so ironic that 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 episode forced you to go through those steps, and yet people are doing those things to say, "No, the episode wasn't even about this subject,"
No,
because
it
it
came out
really
of
walks you
nowhere.
through it. Yeah.
Well,
Um,
you're trying to justify it to yourself, and I think that's
yeah,
what resonates to black people like ourselves, who
yeah,
have been in workplace, who have dealt with Lindy's, let us say, and who, you know it's one thing if someone's calling you a racial slur and you escalate that to an HR. It's never that simple, right? Because then it's like,
no,
oh well, we have a zero tolerance about being called, the N word at work. Like, it's not that. It's just like, okay, well, this person I'm trying to give direction to, especially if you are a supervisor, and I'm trying to give direction to this person. It's not working. This client or this coworker is terrible. Almost always it can be turned on to you. And so then it'll be like your Ruby like coworker is sort of, well, Ruby seems to have no problem with her. Let's promote Ruby because she seems to do such a
yeah,
great job of managing people like Lindy. It's like, well, there's a reason. And it was interesting to see people justify the initial block of the doctor, and in itself turn it around. Oh, he came in and he was aggressive and angry. Like, I saw that, and it's like, oh my goodness, because that wasn't like Gatwa very much played it as like, he comes in, he's calm, because black people know this, right? Like, we come in, we're gonna be very calm. We are going to, like, he introduces himself. I know you don't know me. So once again, acknowledging that I don't, but and then giving the warning. And to see a lot of people's like, oh well, he came in and he was like shouty and ragey, almost comparing him to a previous doctor, Peter Capaldi, who would have been outright rude. He would have been, hey, you pudding brain, turn off the
Yeah.
the bubble and listen to me, like he was someone who had problems, but that's never been Godway. He's a very charming, he was calm and whatever. There was no excuse really for her response. And to say that Ruby was more diplomatic, I mean, I think if someone comes in and kind of very calmly says my life is in danger, I'm more inclined to listen. If I'm on deadline and someone calls in and it's like, hey, would you like to take a survey, which is what Ruby did, I'm going to hang up because I don't have time for a telemarketer. But he's like very much getting to the point. I don't want anything from you. I'm just trying to give you information. And to have that spun is just so for revealing. And that's the sort of, again, the gift that art keeps on giving because of how people are sort of justifying their own sense of not catching on to that immediately
Yeah.
before the credits even roll. And of course, all the later stuff of like thinking that all Black people look alike, or her sense of not refusing to listen to him or refusing. Um, all of these are things that are sort of very clearly revealing of who she is and what. And it's clearly race. It is not xenophobia. Like they've had xenophobes on the shows. It's clearly like you are Black and lesser. And so I think
Mm.
it's the first time I've seen white supremacy, especially on Doctor Who, confronted in such a way. Again, not in the past and not in such an ignorant sense, but just by young futuristic people. It's quite
Yeah.
compelling.
Yeah, definitely, and in a way that reflects the experience that most of us have. Most
Mhm.
of us have not been in a situation like Rosa Parks, but I can't think of a person of color who hasn't experienced the sorts of things that happen in this episode. I mean, my spouse and I, we have these conversations all the time. Like, was this a microaggression conversation? We have them all the time about things. It's one of the things you share stories about, and it's one of the things you don't realize is a weight. It's a mental and emotional weight that you have to carry through your life with you. And I can think of. I think what was interesting is that it is pretty overt at the end. She basically literally says, "You're Black, you can't come with us." And often you don't get that closure in real life. You
Oh
just
yeah.
have a series of microaggressions, but sometimes you do. And I can think of multiple examples in my own life when it's been colleagues mostly, and people I've worked alongside, and I'm like, "Oh, this felt a bit off, that felt a bit off." And then there comes a point where they make a comment that outs them basically. So that has happened too. And then you realize that you weren't crazy for thinking that, or you weren't being overly sensitive for reading, between the lines of what they were saying. And yet we are programmed to think that it is us being sensitive, and 9 times out of 10, or I would say 10 times out of 10, it's not. Um, so and as you say, that sort of insidious racism and that racism that we experience much more readily, I think especially in the UK, where we tend to be, "Oh, don't say what you think, don't show emotion, you have to always be polite." That type of racism is the racism that we all live with daily in our lives.
Well, yes, and I think it's in part because the Doctor is not someone who remembers. I mean, the Doctor has been a Black woman in the past, but does not remember that experience. So this is
Yeah.
new to that. And so in ways that we would have picked on it and perhaps like been like we we might leave, or we would respond differently in a situation, kind of getting a sense of who they were. The Doctor is pushing it, and it's sort of that's sort of the sense of, if you've ever been, of a person of color has ever been called arrogant or whatever, there's a sense that you have pushed someone to have to reveal themselves. It's like, haven't why can't my microaggressions be enough for you
Yeah.
to either stay away or to stay in your place? But now you've pushed it to where now I have to be aggressive in response. And in fact, that tends to be worse. And again, it's sort of the idea that like we're gonna have to make it this blatant, just for you, but also
Yeah.
for the audience. And it also, something I think a lot of folks did not necessarily pick on, and if you pick up on it, if you had done, was sort of the sense of, well, will they regret not getting the Doctor's help later? And it's like, well, they fundamentally don't believe the doctor was capable of helping them. It was sort of like
Yeah.
when racists have refused help from black doctors in the past, or black, well, literal black doctors, of like,
Yeah.
it's more of just, I don't, you're so, they can't believe that he has this technology. So it's, to me, it was compelling because it was sort of pulling the curtain from the entire fantasy of the series. So
Yeah.
traditionally, the white presenting doctor would come in and he's charming. He's David Tennant. He's Matt Smith, and a woman he's just met for 5 minutes. It's like, oh, you're so charming. Let me go into a box with you and go see the stars. That seems reasonable. What could happen to me if I go into this box, right? Like, because it is that sort of privilege that almost that the whole show hinges on, his privilege of being like, oh yeah, I believe you. Like, this box can travel through time. You're not just going to kill me. And if you remove that sort of the benefit of doubt that black people often don't get, you just sound like someone, and they're like, to have like the racist kids like rolling their eyes at the doctor and saying
Yeah.
like, bigger on the inside, like he's like a crazy person on the street, or like when she dismisses it, one lady dismisses it as voodoo, is so of our sense of like, oh, you refuse to see the talent that we have.
Yeah, and then they straight away in that bit that you're talking about, start talking about him, in the third person, even though he's
Yeah.
right in front of them. It's like, "Oh, we've just cut you off, you don't even exist anymore." And I thought that, Ashiti's response, when he realized, like, I believe that his character realized all the way through what was going on, but the
Mhm.
stages of his response, I really liked. His first response is to laugh, like, "This is so ridiculous," and I read something interesting, saying that it shows the stupidity of racism, which often doesn't
Mhm.
get shown. You know, they are stupidly going off in their little boat with their Aryan sleeping bags into the forest, having lived their whole life with everything being provided for them. They are not gonna last a day.
Mhm.
They'll probably drink poison water or something. So it is stupid. So he laughs, and then I think his next response, I can't remember if he cries first or if he shouts first, but it's the sort of incredulity, the laughter, the grief of like having to exist where in a world where people are like this, and also because the doctor is compassionate, a little bit of grief for them, although they don't deserve a bit of it, and the
Mhm.
anger at the system that has created this, that at the circumstances that have brought all these people to this point. And it kind of really reflects, for me, the emotions that I feel when I've experienced things like that. Um, and I have experienced the thing of when she doesn't realize he's the same person, and it's
Mhm.
ages. She's talking to him for ages before she realizes. And it honestly took me quite a long time as an adult to realize that people think like that. I mean, I used to have waist length dreadlocks. I have quite a lot of tattoos. My area is fairly the area I live in is fairly multicultural, but it's not as multicultural as a lot of parts of London. And there were people that I would see, and I knew they didn't recognize who I was, other parents on the school run, things like that. And I was right. I realized that they don't see an individual, they just see blackness. And it
Oh
took me a
yeah.
long time to learn that. And it was a little bit of a revelation when I did. And another example with the colleague, there were two of us in the department of quite a few hundred people, only two of us that were black women. And he asked me a question, this guy, that showed that he's confused me with the other person, and I looked at him, and before I corrected him, he literally said, "Oh, no, it's the other one." It's like, I can't believe those words came out of your mouth, "The
Yeah.
other one."
It's
Um,
it's so frustrating. That happened to me once at a company I'd worked at. It was like, just I was one of two black people. The other they would constantly confuse us. Even after I grew a beard, it was kind of like, okay, well, we both have glasses. If I grow the beard, you could just take the time to just put Stephen Beard, Errol no beard, like that
Yeah.
amount of care, right? Because if you think that's what we would do, right? If I have trouble, I'm pretty good with faces. But if we were trying to, like, if I didn't want to, because it's sort of demeaning, I would sort of try to figure out, okay, well, Madupe glasses, other
Yeah.
person, like whatever I can do to try to jog it, especially if you are bad with names, bad short-term memory in that way. But the
Yeah.
almost the confidence, because usually like with confidence that someone calls you by the wrong name. It's not like a Seinfeld, it's like, hey, you. It's like it's almost a confidence of assuming we are someone, we're sort of interchangeable. While um and while that's annoying, it's sort of kind of like we would let you off the hook of this if you would just admit it in our criminal justice system so that they, there are not people in prison based on the eyewitness of someone who could not tell you apart from your coworker
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
work with. Forget like someone you saw for 5 minutes. And so that's just a fascinating thing. So to have, but there were so many of these modern targetings that in the episode that black people have experienced, um and that is sort of what becomes the kind of issue of debate and discussion. And I love that of like, because going in, I think there was concern that it was just going to be a standard social media is bad concept, which was sweeping rather than like social media is bad to the way that it has sort of helped promote and nurture white supremacism, whereas um, it has proven very helpful tool and a fostering of community for people of color. So a lot of the internet is sucks, sort of sweeping comments you see, even about TikTok, even though women have used TikTok as a sort of community aspect without sort of acknowledging that. So I like that it was sort of no, no, no. This is like in the racist sense, this is bad when you're sort of, and the faux friendliness that people present on it when they are
Yeah.
not particularly kind people, in general, is revealing. So, and to bring that back to your discussions of colonialism, how do you address that in your fantasy world, and how that mirrors what you sort of see and politics today, especially in the UK? There's a lot of uh, I think tenseness with immigration and so forth.
There is, and it is entirely whipped up by self-serving individuals, let's just put it that way. But yeah, there is. So in my book, it's quite hard to go into it without it being a little bit of a spoiler, because the main thrust that I wanted to present in terms of colonialism in A Song of Legends Lost is to do with our disconnection from our heritage. Um, the best way for me to sort of talk around that subject is the writer N.K. Jemisin. She once had a Twitter thread about the idea that the pyramids and other ancient world wonders from countries of black and brown people were created by aliens, about the inherent racism in that. It's easier to believe that aliens created this wonder than it is to think that black and brown people were capable of doing this.
Oh,
Um, and that I was already writing the book when I read that tweet. It was quite a long time ago, and it just sort of two things dovetailed, and I had a sort of epiphany, because I've always liked the lost civilizations trope, and that was in my book. But I was also addressing this was a colonial world. There was colonization, but the people didn't realize because it was so long ago. Um, and without getting too spoilery, it's about how they find out that they are actually a colonized people, and that, you know, they have a heritage that is very powerful, and it has been denied them, let's just say. And also the overall theme in my book is about ancestor magic. Although I introduce it by saying, oh, it's about warriors who can summon their ancestors in battle, there are other elements to the world's connection to ancestors that run a lot deeper than, oh, they're there for fighting. And those elements are slowly uncovered. So I suppose in my book, the way that I approach colonialism is about what is lost, what has been denied us, both through the deliberate erasure and through the lies that we believe, that we hear repeated and we believe and internalize, and then use to diminish ourselves. If that's not too woolly an answer.
No,
uh,
that's great. The point you'd made about the aliens has been something that always bothered me as well, and it was one of those things that I guess sort of a microaggression theory in itself, because a lot of people
yeah,
would present it without realizing how they weren't necessarily deliberately insulting brown people or black people with this comment, but how else could you interpret it? It's like, oh, of course, how the pyramids could only exist is that it's rather than the Occam's razor of they were smarter than white people at the time. It had to be, well, that can't be. It must be that it has to be this external force. And that's been what you're sort of addressing also addresses a lot of the issues with how people of color are often presented in sci-fi or fantasy. So tropes, especially when from the vantage point of white authors, it's usually um, kind of the native or sort of tribal African society or planet that is but rarely the sort of uber advanced, by their terms, alien society is rarely presented as with people of color, or the sense that people of color can't they have trouble comprehending that people of color would even exist in different worlds. There was a question of like, well, wait a minute, how could it be black Vulcans? It's like, what are you talking about? Like, it's like, well, it's a hot planet. Like, why you should ask why they're white Vulcans,
yeah,
or Krypton, or planets of like where they are only we only ever see often white people. Um, there's this presumption of like we are almost a mistake, or that we kind of exist here as a mistake, almost acknowledging, okay, well, maybe slavery was bad and maybe we should not have sort of brought these folks here at all. Maybe they should not have existed. And that's usually um, discouraging when sort of the future is or different planets are presented. So it's just nice to see sort of something different in fantasy, or sort of different in how you kind of you sort of treat that, right?
yeah, yeah.
So before we wind up, I mean, what so this is sort of a trilogy. When would the other your first book's going to be next year, early 2025? Have you sort of kind of paced out like when the others would come out?
So yeah, so they're due to be published annually, yearly after that. So the second one should be out in spring 26, and the final part in spring 27. So and I'm nearing sort of nearing the end of writing the second one. I say that I've been talking about how I'm in the middle of my chaos draft. I have a lot of words on book two. Book two will be finished before book one is published, so they should be a year gap between all of them. And they do form an overarching story that I think really delves into the subtler aspects of colonialism.
um, and is not to get too far into adaptations, of course, but do you is it something that it would $200 million budget to bring faithfully to a screen, or is it potentially something that could be a streamer on Hulu, but those have expensive budgets as well. But sometimes in the past you've talked to folks who it's like, I can't imagine, because I can't imagine a technology being able to sort of fairly replicate what my imagination has. But do have you seen anything that at least feels like maybe they could do justice to your work if you were to let that
So
happen?
I'm a big anime fan, although
Ah,
I'm a sort of old school anime fan, and I'm a huge fan of Arcane, which is back in November, yay. I would love a animated adaptation because,
Oh,
I
wow, that's
love
good.
animation. That's sort of, that would be my absolute dream. Not
Oh,
saying that I would not love a live action with the $200 million budget. That would be amazing too. But I think, and I'm a huge Studio Ghibli fan as well.
no.
I in my head, I see animated scenes because I think there's a lot you can do with animation. I feel that certain aspects of the world, visually, and just the style of combat and the magic systems lend themselves to really creative art.
Mhm.
So, and I wouldn't mind a video game, to be honest.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah,
Those
like, I
are
would
That's
awesome.
awesome.
um,
I'm big into immersive work as well, immersive theater, and I feel like there's a lot of for younger folks. They like the idea of being part of that experience when you talk about
yeah.
a video game version, and of course the artwork of the limitless opportunity you could do with animation. I love animation as well. Compared to potentially CGI. So that all sounds great. Thank you so much for taking time out of your, just so folks know, I am in Portland, Oregon. Madupe is in London, so we are like a full day apart of sorts. So thank you for speaking to me towards the end of your day. It's been great, and folks should uh, when available, go check out Song of Legends Lost. And where can people find you to sort of keep up on progress of when things going to be released or when you might be traveling so they can kind of see you and do and so forth?
So I'm on most social media because I'm a social media junkie. I'm at MH on all of those sites. Twitter, we don't call it X, TikTok, Instagram, blah blah blah. And my website, w.mhainde.com. I have a newsletter there which you can sign up for, which will be the best place to hear about any appearances I have coming up. Um, so yeah, follow me.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks, folks, for listening and like, share, subscribe. We'll catch you next time. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks for having me.